Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you to Hector and Ida for organizing this series of talk. And before I'm going to introduce Beatrice for the talk of tonight, I'm going to present you with a little bit of a note for the recording. So welcome to Knowledge Asymmetries in the Age of Machine Learning, a symposium about the relationship between governance, participation, and technological knowledge in the world today. This event is organized by the Writing Machine Collective, a Hong Kong-based group of media artists, as you have seen in the presentation. This talk will be recorded. So if you wish not to be recorded, you can just cut the video and cut the sound. So in this way, you won't appear on the recording. And I'm going to quickly describe the rundown of this talk. So first, we're going to have the presentation by Beatrice Fazi. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. At any time, you can ask a question on the chat. So anytime during the presentation, you can ask a question on the chat, and during the Q&A, we can go back to your question on the chat. But you can also wait the Q&A to ask your question directly to Beatrice Fazi. And so you can use your microphone and your camera to directly address the speaker. So if you prefer this mode of participation, wait for the Q&A. So Beatrice Fazi, thank you very much to be here tonight. We are very happy to have you. And we met like 2 years ago for this conference in Belgrade, and it was like the last time I traveled outside of Hong Kong, so I remember. And it was very nice to meet you, and we appreciate your work very much. To present your work, so you are a lecturer in digital humanities at the School of Media, Art and Humanities at the University of Sussex. You have a background in philosophy with a PhD and an MA from Goldsmiths. Your work explores questions located at the intersection of philosophy, technoscience, and culture. And your research interests include media philosophy and theory, digital aesthetics, continental philosophy, computation and artificial intelligence, critical and cultural theory. Your primary research interest, that is also a bit linked to a part of the talk tonight, I think. Your primary research interest is the abstract character of computational systems and the ways in which the computational method might produce new forms of intelligibility, while also challenging present and past accounts of sensibility. So without further ado, I'm going to let you the ground for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien, for this kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to join you all today. Many thanks to the Writing Machine Collective for this invitation and for your interest in my work. I'm going to quickly share my screen with you to show some slides. My talk today is entitled The Incommensurability Between Human and Algorithmic Thought. In the time that I have at my disposal for this presentation, I want to engage with the theme of knowledge asymmetries in the age of machine learning that your program of events focuses on. I will discuss with you how my philosophical understanding of computational automation engages with issues and questions that bring to the fore precisely those asymmetries. Knowledge asymmetries there, I will argue, are not only about indeed knowing, but are about being too. While addressing the knowledge generated by a computing machine, I will consider the ontology of the same machines. Epistemological asymmetries, I will argue, are also often ontological asymmetries. The talk today is based on this article, Beyond Human Deep Learning Explainability and Representation, which was published in the journal Theory, Culture and Society. With this presentation today, I do not want to review all the points that I made in the article. Rather, I will focus on some of the key contentions that I developed there, emphasizing those claims and arguments that directly speak to your program's theme of knowledge asymmetries. There are different ways of approaching the ontoepistemic disparities of computational culture. Today, my problem area is via the much discussed issue of explainability in artificial intelligence. Interpreting or explaining the decisions made by artificial intelligence is a key challenge for contemporary society. Explainable artificial intelligence, also sometimes known as XAI, is an expression used to denote different techniques and methods that want to do precisely that: explain, justify, interpret why an artificial intelligence system gives a particular response to some data inputs or how it has calculated a certain result. This is important because artificial intelligence is increasingly part of our everyday, embedded in those devices and interfaces that make our present. AI is everywhere today, and this is because computation is everywhere too. Significantly, some of these AI programs are often in part opaque not only to their end users, but also to the programmers who originally set them up. These AI programs are what science, academia, and the general public too often call black boxes. It's clear that these programs work, but it's often not equally clear how or why. So black box is an expression that comes from computing and engineering, which in turn have borrowed it from cybernetics. The expression is used to describe an object or a system that is viewed uniquely in terms of its inputs and outputs, and whose internal workings thus remain concealed. Characteristically, when approaching a black box, one is interested only in stimuli and responses. One considers what goes in and what comes out of the black box, not its inner components or operations. The trope of the black box is a recurring one in the sociology of science, and also in science and technology studies. Famously, in the 1980s and 1990s, Bruno Latour described parts of science that have been accepted and are no longer controversial as black boxes. Science, Latour says, becomes a black box whenever its inner operations are no longer open for scrutiny or debate, when consensus has been reached about certain results, when the success of a theory or a method obscures how scientific and technical work operates, and when an hypothesis is settled as a matter of fact. Always within the diverse domain of the sociology of knowledge, social constructivist positions, such as, for instance, the social construction of technology, stress the need to open the black box, to recognize the interpretative flexibility of an artifact, while also crediting users as agents of technological change. Today, I want to argue that when considering computational automation, concerns about AI as a black box technology, yes, in part they recall these early debates in science studies, yet they also exceed them, they transcend them. In my view, the black box character of contemporary AI system is first of all a technical condition. Of course, these systems are part of the contemporary world and have an impact on the everyday lives of millions of people. I acknowledge that, with respect to this impact, a social constructivist perspective can be useful to account for the involvements of relevant social groups. However, if opening the black box means asking how technology is made, and I'm here paraphrasing the title of a famous essay in social constructivist technology studies by the Dutch scholar Wiebe Baker, then while doing so, while we are asking how technology is made, we cannot avoid addressing the ontological and epistemological specificities of the same technology. So in arguing this, you see, I diverge from the social constructivist claim that the technical and political question, how to make technology, can be answered by bracketing or bypassing the philosophical question, what is technology? I argue the opposite, in fact. I argue that and propose that we should put that philosophical question, what is technology, center stage. In the case of artificial intelligence, my proposition is that we should not overlook the computational character of these technologies. Insofar these technologies are computational, there are calculative techniques that involve quantifying and systematizing the real world through operations of discretization. Above all, since they are computational, these are calculative techniques that involve decision-making. In a computational context, decision-making is the mechanized process that results in the selection of a particular result or output among possible alternatives. This decisional capacity of computational system is inscribed in the definition of an algorithmic procedure, a step-by-step effective method to address a problem that can be posed as a yes or no question of input values. And I'm here referring to Alan Turing's 1936 definition. In these computational systems, transparency is then a matter of accountability vis-à-vis their automated decision-making capacities. Thus, while we could say that all technologies are black boxes to a certain extent, so even a door handle can be approached as one because knowledge of its inner working is not strictly necessary to open a door, while the consequences of the black box character of artificial intelligence are different because in this case, it is agency itself that is opaque. The decision-making of computational agents affects millions of people every day. The range of this decision is vast. It pertains to mechanisms of classification, clustering, ranking, and pattern finding, which are employed, for instance, in credit card fraud detection, spam filters, search engines, market segmentation, social media advertising, insurance and credit scoring, healthcare management, transport and logistics, loan qualification, and mobile communication. These, of course, are just some instances, but it's important to stress how these and other similar operations were often determined by humans in the past. Today, the human user rarely has a concrete sense of the reason or mechanism of certain results, or what inputs they have followed. The task left to the social scientist, the cultural theorist, the philosopher, the legal scholar, the critical theorist, and the artist too, is asking what could count as cracking open those AI black boxes responsible for so much contemporary decision-making. Although involving various arenas of public and academic discussion, this question has been most explicitly developed within debates about the politics and governance of algorithms. I will not review these discussions today. What I will say, however, is that there is consensus on the fact that automated cognitive agents will play ever more significant roles in regulating and directing our lives. So yes, while it's true that the black box label may often be abused or also misused, it's also true that this label has gained much currency because of the real implications of many AI systems that we use every day. What academia and the general public alike are asking for is transparency regarding how security, government, media, retail, finance, science, and industry, they all employ AI on a daily basis, often to influence human action. Explainability, then, is a key word for present and future computational culture, raising equally unique social and ethical challenges. Returning now to the topic of this series of events organized by the Writing Machine Collective, what I want to stress is that we cannot consider the question of knowledge asymmetries that this lecture series is considering without addressing the challenge of explainable AI. And it's precisely what I want to do today. This challenge of explainable AI has been taken up in different contexts and by a very diverse range of intellectual agendas. My own contribution to this debate is a philosophical contribution that nonetheless wants to speak of and to the social cultural aspects of this problem. In my research, I often stress how contemporary developments in AI are departing from what I call the simulative paradigm, which has been looming over artificial intelligence research since Alan Turing's proposition of an imitation game to test the cognitive capabilities of an artificial system. And of course, it's worth remembering that that proposition was put forth in 1950. In my work, I often claim that we should conceive of automated modes of thought in such a way as to supersede the hope the machines might replicate human cognitive faculties. Others argue for the possibility of considering the algorithmic modes of thought of computing machines as dramatically alien to human thought. My philosophical study of explainability in AI develops that line of argumentation, thus maintaining a commitment to questions about the nature of thinking in the 21st century. The philosophical question of algorithmic thought in relation to explainability in AI involves addressing this crucial issue. What if machines think and we do not recognize their thinking because these cognitive processes are beyond human representations of thought? Well, the philosophical concept that I propose to engage precisely with the issue is the concept of incommensurability. Incommensurability is, in my view, a powerful notion to address explainable AI. Originating in ancient Greek mathematics, the concept of incommensurability denotes the absence of a common unit of measurement between two magnitudes. The development of this concept drove the distinction between geometry and arithmetic and is also central to the study of the ratios of numbers. Outside mathematics, however, the notion of incommensurability is used to denote that for which no shared nomenclature or shared ground for evaluation exists. In this sense, incommensurability is a key concept in 20th century philosophy of science. In 1962, the philosophers of science Thomas Kuhn and Paul Feyerabend, independently but equally influentially, argued that successive scientific theories, where their associated concepts, methods, and worldviews are incommensurable. So for Feyerabend, incommensurability was mostly a semantic issue, which addressed to challenge conceptual conservatism in science and the approach to explanation, reduction, and scientific advancement employed by logical positivism. In Kuhn's historical philosophy of science, too, incommensurability was a problem on language. So for Kuhn as well, and to quote Michael Polanyi, whose philosophical work on the practice of science influenced both Kuhn and Feyerabend, scientists from diverse schools of thought and periods in time think differently, speak a different language, they live in a different world. Beyond semantics, however, incommensurability was also a methodological and perceptual issue and a problem in taxonomy for Kuhn. He described as incommensurable the stark contrast between theoretical frameworks for which not only nomenclatures do not overlap, but also for which no shared perception or methods of classification exist. In the philosophy of science, the notion of incommensurability is rather controversial. Its meaning and usefulness are often contested, and discussions on this topic are never really fully resolved. I will not go into the discussion, and I will not chronicle the consequences of these discussions here. What I will do rather is to argue that it's valuable to consider how the commensurable has been introduced and addressed in that philosophical context, in that tradition of thought. This is because Kuhn and Feyerabend, they both proposed the concept of incommensurability while assessing the epistemic possibilities of scientific explanation. Precisely in relation to explanation, then, I want to mobilize the notion of incommensurability to claim that explainability in AI is a representational and communicational issue, which challenges phenomenological and existential modes of comparisons between human and algorithmic thinking operations. To expand on this claim, I want to focus with you on deep learning, which is a technique at the center of debates about explainable AI. Although artificial neural networks have been around since the 1940s, it's only in the past decade or so that, thanks to increasing volumes of data and computational power, AI research and industry have become to exploit and capitalize on artificial neural networks' potential. An artificial neural network system relies on layers of artificial neurons to process information. These layers of artificial neurons are connected and they influence each other in a complex web of interactive units. A lower layer of neurons perform a computation and transmits this result to the layer above, enriching the final outcome of the layer at the top. What is obtained in each layer is a new representation which can be employed as input for deeper layers. A neural network is then said to learn because it can tweak its calculation and modify its interactions by tuning parameters via activation and backpropagation among layers until the desired output, that is, the desired final representation, is produced. The network is called deep if its structure encompasses intermediary hidden layers between the input and the output. Here it's important to note that the architecture of a deep learning system is different from that of a standard artificial neural network precisely because of the presence of these multiple nonlinear hidden layers. We know that deep learning techniques are much discussed and often hyped today because they are quite successful. Beyond reports on its promising results, however, deep learning has also caught popular attention in a rather less flattering light. Chances are that when popular press articles, but also research papers, are alarming us about black boxes, they are indeed talking about the supposed opacity of deep neural nets. The strength of a deep neural network lies in its capacity to find patterns in large data sets and improve this performance with minimal human intervention. Yet the knowledge generated in this model remains in part implicit due to non-linear of deep learning, its compressed information, and the distributed character of the network's representations, which rely on the many configurations of its large set of variables. Such a complex layered architecture of deep learning programs entails difficulty in comprehending what nodes and layers have learned, and how they have interacted to transform a representation at one level into another representation at a higher, more abstract step. Moreover, interpretability is not a standard feature of deep learning, also because of the difficulty of producing a satisfactory mathematical theory as a foundation for these architectures. So, interestingly, what makes deep technique powerful often makes their theoretical underpinning tentative. Progress comprehending these computational activities is achieved by trial and error, and operations are often rationalized retrospectively. Technically speaking, then, the crux of the problem of explainability in deep learning lies in artificial neural networks not returning a clear representation of their inner workings. Deep neural networks lack model interpretability, so when considering why a machine made a particular decision or one prediction instead of another, we remain ignorant at worst and agnostic at best. In my work on explainable AI, I address this condition by mobilizing the role the representation plays not only in how the machine is supposed to explain itself, but also in how the machine operates in the first place. Deep learning automates the extraction of features from data. Features are those properties and characteristics of data that the system learns to distinguish and organize in order to recognize patterns and make predictions. Deep neural networks are algorithms for classification from features, and if deep learning is largely representation learning, this is because of the way in which it operates upon features via multiple levels of representation. Now, to exemplify this point, which is central to the overall argument I'm trying to building, I want to consider with you the increasing ability of computers to recognize human handwriting. This we know is something notoriously hard to perform computationally, and for which more traditional programming techniques do not work well, because it's difficult to prefigure and then encode an instruction that will formally describe such a task. In other words, relatively simple, immediate human intuition on how to identify shapes are not easily expressed in computational terms. With deep learning, the situation changes. So let's assume we want a program to recognize a handwritten digit such as 0. In the case of supervised learning, thousands of scans of handwritten zeros are fed to the machine as training examples. The program then learns to recognize the digit, not how a human might, for instance, determining that a 0 resembles a vertical oval, but by mechanically detecting complex pattern or darkened latter pixel expressed as matrices of numbers. This is arguably a different form of perception or of input reception. And groundbreaking research on how a computational system can elaborate visual information that humans cannot even receive or perceive is being developed in the field of computer vision. My point here, however, is that beyond physical data reception, we also witness a specific form of abstractive capacity, one akin to an automated mode of conceptualization, that is, an automated mode of forming internal representations meant to generalize while abstracting from observed facts or phenomena. As the computer scientist Yoshua Bengio has put it, the central principle of machine learning methodologies, including deep learning, is the automated discovery of abstraction. A deep learning algorithm, Bengio also writes, is a particular kind of representation learning procedure that discovers multiple levels of representation with higher level features representing more abstract aspects of the data. In my philosophical work on explainability, I focus on precisely this aspect of the current developments in AI technologies, how the extraction and organization of information from data, that is, the technologies perform, is specific to their computational character, and how it is therefore independent of human access. So while much computer programming history has consisted in making human abstraction significant and operative with the instrumental remit of algorithmic machines, with deep learning we face the opposite case. Now the abstraction and consequent instruction that the machine gives itself now require interpretation for them to be significant and operative for humans. In the example that I mentioned earlier, the example of recognizing human handwriting, the autonomy of automation is demonstrated by a deep learning system producing internal representation independently from the phenomenological or experiential ground of the human programmer. Deep learning that shows that we should pay attention to the specificity of human and algorithmic modes of abstraction because of the different ontological and epistemological grounds of humans on the one hand and machines on the other. Different, or indeed incommensurable kinds of abstraction inform human modes of thought on the one hand and algorithmic ones on the other. Incommensurability is the right concept to bring in because the abstractive choices of humans and those of computing machines cannot be measured against each other or compared by a common standard. So the challenge for the philosophical study of computational automation is to find the epistemological means to theorize, as well as possible, these incommensurable orders the automated computational agents produce. Inevitably, the notion of incommensurability to be developed must transcend that proposed in the history of the philosophy of science. So the long-term goal here is not to apply Kuhn's or Feyerabend's respective understandings of the incommensurable to computational media or computational culture, but to develop a radical version of the concept to address the specificities of human and algorithmic modes of abstraction. The case of deep learning demonstrates that, when we are thinking and talking of computational agents, our theoretical efforts should attempt to move from strictly phenomenological analysis and existential qualifications towards a more speculative mode of investigation. Adopting a speculative mode of investigation, we should address the critical prospect of understanding what explanation and interpretation may be in the formalizing space of computation. Key to the speculative effort is, in relation to the study of computational automation, is the possibility of constructing a theory of knowledge specific to computational agents, a theory that can be advanced only by assessing the specificity of machines. So I'm going to propose the following valuable programmatic point that can be drawn from the incommensurability debate in the philosophy of science. Both Kuhn's and Feyerabend's respective understandings of incommensurability have been accused of denying the possibility of progress and truth in science, and thus implying irrationality. This accusation was strongly rebutted by both scholars. Claims about incommensurability do not imply the comparison is not possible, but it's much more difficult than the logical positivism and the logical empiricism of the time assumed it was. But Kuhn and Feyerabend made the notion of the incommensurable a powerful weapon in their post-positivist arsenals, and they used it to challenge evaluation and explanation based on absolute universal criteria or a neutral observation language. Although differences then certainly exist between the context and the aims of that debate, which pertain to the possibility of theoretic comparison, and my own present study of deep learning and explainability, I propose that we can also mobilize the concept of incommensurability to problematize the 21st century's positivist approaches to computational culture in society. Again, it's key to stress here that doing so does not imply relativism, but in fact quite the opposite. I'm arguing for the need to be loyal to the specificity of humans and machines in our comparisons. Similarly, we should not take for granted the fact that when dealing with computing machines abstractions, we are working with models that are, at the same time, within and beyond logos. In other words, these models are logical because they are computational and thus based on the possibility of a formal, logical mathematical account of calculation. However, in a different sense, they are also allogical because they are, at present, inexpressible or unrepresentable by humans, where logos, according to its ancient Greek etymology, not only means reason or proportion, but also word, discourse, speech, and derives from the verb lego, that means to count, to tell, to speak. So focusing on the notion of incommensurability allows us to emphasize the paradoxical condition of logical mathematical abstraction in computation, which, despite being a key tool for human attempts to organize and make sense of reality, today also surpasses the human-centric instrumental horizon with its AI implementation. For these AI-native models to be held rationally accountable, we should first ask whose and what rationality we are discussing. This question is radically open and acknowledges that a comparison between kinds and modes of thought is, to an extent, necessary to study AI's thinking procedures. The use of terms such as thinking or intelligence, which originated within human epistemology, but the use of this term does not contradict my argument. Rather, the use confirms the inevitability of a comparison, although a comparison that will always be incomplete or partial because humans, as observers and interpreters, can only offer epistemic representation that they have been shaped within their own ontological domain. I'm now moving towards the final part of my talk. Before concluding, I want to, however, return to that claim of mine that I signposted earlier. Earlier, I said that considering the incommensurability between human and algorithmic thought is particularly relevant in the context of debates about explainable AI, because it shows how explainability is a representational problem that pertains to communication. I can add now that for abstractions to be successfully represented and thus expressed and shared, a common experience between the communicator and the receiver of that communication must often be in place. Of course, this is not possible in the case of human-machine interactions, for no common phenomenological or existential ground exists between human abstraction and those of a computational agent. Here, then, I'm stressing the difficulty of comparing human and machine abstractive operations when ontological grounds shift and epistemic possibility consequently vary. Acknowledging an incommensurability between how humans and machines build models involves recognizing this ontological and epistemological disparity between how humans and computational agents make decisions. Inevitably, this discrepancy is mirrored in how such decisions might be respectively recounted or represented by humans and artificial algorithmic agents. The philosophical research on explainability and incommensurability that I'm proposing is thus a study of the 21st century development of computational procedure for which, at present, no adequate human cognitive representation exists and for which, significantly, human cognitive representations are also unnecessary. In this respect, the very last point that I want to make is that incommensurability is a translation failure. On the one hand, a satisfactory translation between incommensurable entities is difficult, or perhaps even impossible. On the other, a translation failure also signals the limits of approaching explainable AI by searching for the quality or property of being translatable. It's important to stress this claim vis-à-vis current issues in the contemporary quest for fair, accountable, transparent, trustworthy AI, precisely because that quest appears to be predicated on research that understands interpretability in terms of translation. Within debates on XAI, such an equation between interpretation and translation can be observed in research that promotes the advancement of future XI systems by developing new techniques able to produce interpretable models of machine learning operations. These models, in turn, are paired with interfaces to advance useful human-machine translations, thus generating meaningful explanatory dialogues for end users. Interpretability via human-machine translation is, for instance, the explicit goal of the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency's XAI initiative, which aims to develop human-centered perspectives in the design of artificial cognitive agents. Let's quickly consider precisely DARPA's XAI initiatives as an example of one of the many quests for interpretability in AI. The challenge for DARPA, as well as for other parties involved in explainable AI, is to achieve understanding without compromising the predictive power and overall learning performance of the computational system. To do so, DARPA's XAI initiative encompasses various projects ranging from the design of entirely new kinds of deep neural network comprising smaller and thus more easily understood modules, to the borrowing of insight from the psychology of human expertise in human decision-making. What observation can be advanced about DARPA's XAI in relation to the issue of incommensurability? I will propose three. First, consistent with similar technoscientific attempts, DARPA's quest for explainable AI aims to bring what is beyond human knowledge back into the domain of human cognitive representation. Second, the goal of DARPA's XAI project is to find a meaningful representation of the machine's own abstraction, even though this representation might be only useful or valuable to human actors, and not strictly speaking necessary for the operativity of the machine itself. Noticeably, there is not yet an obvious way of designing an artificial computational system that can explain itself. Just as there is no consensus on what the explanation should look like, that is, what such an explanation should aim to represent. Third, then, the following question must be answered. Will giving enough speculative credit and attention to incommensurable operations of artificial intelligence system be enough to produce such a shared account of a useful, successful explanation? But this question constitutes my conclusion. I want to leave it open to future research on the topic, which will have to further problematize the possibility of explanation in AI, precisely because the opportunity of direct human-machine translations for artificial cognitive systems that are beyond human representation, while that possibility can be questioned via the notion of incommensurability. In a famous polemical essay, the scholar of technology Langdon Wiener criticized imperatives of opening the black box being obeyed, in his opinion, by the social construction of technology, a position that we saw at the beginning of my talk. Wiener noted that upon opening the black box, the risk was of finding it empty. In a parallel yet distinct sense, we can borrow Wiener's famous expression to consider now whether contemporary explainable artificial intelligence imperatives of opening the black box are running a similar risk. If there is indeed such a risk, in my view, it is less of finding the black box empty, but of realizing that there is nothing to translate or to render, precisely because the possibility of human representation never existed there in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you. Yeah. So, I'm going to ask if there is questions in the audience. So you can ask the question directly to Beatrice, or you can write in the chat as you prefer. So maybe I'm going to go with the first question. I was wondering, because like referring to the paper that your talk was drew from, in this paper you were referring to the question of attention and human attention. So more like the cultural inscriptions of some of the questions you discussed today. So I was wondering, like, how the question you discussed today in your talk would what would be the link with the ways in which attention is is framed in the current society and economies.
Thank you, Damien. Yes, the question of attention often comes up when considering the uses of artificial intelligence systems in everyday tasks and activities. It's often commented how machines can be distraction machines, indeed, or they can nudge or influence human action by grasping and molding our attention capacities. There are ways in which the question of attention links also to the question of explainability. And the one that I want to consider with you today is through a proposition. The proposition is indeed to enlarge the study of what I call algorithmic thought beyond the trope of or the expression of intelligence. There is a full range of cognitive capabilities and possibilities that are being automated or are becoming quasi-autonomous via the use and application of these computational agents. So attention is indeed one of that. So in a way, we could also consider how machine learning is a form of paying attention insofar as involves the selection of inputs and outputs, the organization of that selection through certain parameters and so on and so forth. So there are ways in which these modes of tentative comparison, philosophical comparison, epistemological comparison between different cognitive registers can be also applied to that debate. The point that I wanted to make today with my talk is that comparison is possible, as I said. It's just that it's much more difficult than these labels, intelligent thinking, attention, often imply. So while these labels, we have to use them because in a sense, in a Wittgensteinian sense, the limits of our world are the limits of our language, or vice versa. So we have this language, we have this perception, and this is the way in which we can express also the possibility of these machines having cognitive faculties. But nonetheless, the comparison needs always to be problematized by considering that that cognitive structure may be very, very different, because the ontology behind it is profoundly different.
Thank you. So is there any questions from the participant to the talk? Okay, so yeah. Okay, so maybe I'm going to go with the second question. in your book, like contingent computation, abstraction, experience, and indeterminacy in computational aesthetics, you were referring in the introduction to those form of situated computing that makes the computers closer to humans and human situation and the vernacularities of human situation. And at the same time, in the talk of today, you say like there is this black box, and we cannot have a fantasy to open the black box because there would be just no system of interpretation to translate what's inside the black box. And so do you think, like, nevertheless, the situatedness of computational technology can lead to some kind of understanding about the computational today and the algorithmic and the machine learning eventually, technologies, I mean, intellectual technologies embedded in it? Or is it really not possible, no matter how situated the computation is and how close to human day-to-day activities and practices?
That's a great question, because of course, yes, there are these black boxes, and I agree with certain critics who say that this black box label is often abused or misused. It is, but nonetheless, there is, I mean, the fact that these machines, or the operation of these machines, can be opaque or not as legible as we would want it to be for different reasons. The reasons there I was considering today were mostly like logical mathematical reasons, but of course there are other ways in which a computer program can be black boxed. For instance, it's a question of literacy. People might not be able to understand what's going on because they are not technically trained to do so, or there is a black box character due to, I don't know, proprietary reason, code being closed and hence invisible, opaque, and not transparent because it belongs to somebody, and hence it cannot be scrutinized. And so there are different levels in which a system can be a black box, and one doesn't exclude the other. In fact, often they intertwine together. But your question about being situated, that's crucial, because the black box is also always a box that is inserted or situated in an environment, and as such it's always a social machine in the lesson sense of the word. We were like to use that kind of vocabulary. So in a way it can be also a question of considering systems within other system and how different black boxes interact in a system that it's a systematic environment that is in itself a larger black box, and so on and so forth. These are all debates that have been discussed also, of course, in cybernetics, or in the way in which behaviorism, which consider the brains as a closed system or a black box in itself, also addressed cognition and so on and so forth. So yes, the question of situation of the black box being situated in an environment is crucial, precisely because it transforms this black box character into like societal, and by society I mean like also in a figurative sense question. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have a question from the audience. So question from Yi Tung Ho. So can you see the chat, Beatrice?
Let me just make my window appear again. Damien, so you are referring to a specific one?
Yeah, like I can read the one from 920, so I'm gonna read it.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. The concept of explainable AI is very thought-provoking, but I am thinking we are using AI now to solve very complex problems that traditional rule-based programming, which is easily explained, understood, cannot easily solve, but humans can. But is this possible that this is impossible when we cannot truly understand how human thought also works completely, or can we? Is not the human brain also a black box?
Yes, this great question that goes back is precisely to what we were saying before. The black box, the brain has been referred to as the utmost or the most egregious form of black box of all, being, if we take the definition, the cybernetic definition of black box as a system whose internal organization is hidden, but whose inputs and outputs are known, while there's indeed how much of our brain activities are often approached. And I mentioned before behaviorism as a tradition in cognitive science, in studies of cognition, that indeed approach the brain as a black box. Of course, that is, behaviorism has been discredited, rightly so for many reasons, but nonetheless, it's very, very interesting how connectionism, for instance, which is the largely philosophical but also technical view on the brain that has inspired artificial neural network, nonetheless interprets the brain as a system that's partially closed and was the hope we can have to approach it is only through the interactions of simpler elements, neurons inside of it. So yes, I agree with you that the brain is indeed, or has been represented, if we want to still talk about representation, as a black box. And it's very interesting to see how these tropes recur in the history both of cognitive science and artificial intelligence to explain and find metaphors, suitable metaphors to describe the way in which we think cognition operates today for human and machine cognition.
Okay. Thank you. So there was another question I skipped from Charrieras. And so thank you, Beatrice. Speaking of the limitations of words, what do you think about using the term perception to describe automated processes of seeing?
Yeah, that's the limits of language. It's an interesting challenge indeed. Perception. Whenever we talk about or we read about these systems, often we use a very anthropomorphic language. So we say the machines see or machines think. And of course, we need to be careful about employing this language, but nonetheless, I believe it's impossible not to use this sort of figurative language. And in relation to perception, in the case of deep learning, for instance, the way in which we can see or we can say that these machines perceive is by taking perception to be input reception. But of course, there's a huge body of literature in philosophy, psychology, and so on and so forth that has elaborated understandings of perception well beyond the input reception understanding that in the case of machine learning, in the case of saying the machine learning might perceive, we take perception to be. So in that case, I guess perception will have to be input reception or input selection and elaboration. And that's, of course, a limiting way of understanding perception for many reasons. They have also been proved by experimental psychology and so on and so forth.
Thank you. So yeah, Andrew? Yeah.
Hopefully I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much for your talk. And forgive me if I misinterpreted what you were saying, but I was really intrigued by your talk about speculative modes of engagement and what these would actually look like for people like myself who work in the social science or kind of social constructivist kind of tradition, about how we may do such work when we are typically faced with people who talk about the axiomatic outputs of computation and how we might bring in that kind of logical elements of computation, how I might try and express that. I realize that's perhaps maybe a step away from what you were talking about, but I thought it might be interesting to hear those reflections if that's possible. Thanks.
Oh, that's a great question, Andrew, because of course the speculative mode of analysis doesn't mean it's not like flight of fancy. It has to be based on observation and study. Nonetheless, speculation in the sense, for me, it's like an opening up of conditions of possibility, and I take that in a Kantian sense of the term, and so being very much based in observation and indeed in taking into full account the specificity of the system. So it's not like an abandoning the axiomatic, as you said before, by going precisely within the axiomatic to see those ways in which this system can operate in ways that are not in fact so limited by our representations of them. So in a way, I spent a lot of time and years, in fact, trying to find non-representationalist way of accounting for computation. And after having done that work, I realized that indeed we can never really get away from representation. We are bound to represent because we are, insofar we are abstracting, and we cannot experience without abstracting. Indeed, I'm very Whiteian, as you might know, that abstraction is not moving away from experience. It's the way in which you enter experience. It's the way you enter the world. It's not living in a ivory tower. It's the way in which you engage with the world by abstracting, and abstracting does representing. So speculation in that respect is coming up with an attuning and refining and finding new nuances to those representations. And while we may have some very good representations, or as good as we can have them now, of how human brains or human cognition operates, there are still tentative representations, and so we can have like different tentative representations also for the way in which machines might be said to think or themselves to represent, and those representation doesn't have to overlap. The challenge is indeed always to consider the specificity and the difficulties in comparing those specificity, but I'm keen to stress the speculation is not a flight of fancies, as if speculation has to be based on serious and engaged and closed work that starts from taking into account the full plethora of the way in which these machines work.
Thank you. Before I read the next question, I'm just going to ask a very tiny question because it's related to the previous question. I think in his chapter, like Alexander Galloway wrote a chapter called "Are Some Things Unrepresentable?" And he was giving the example of the American army trying to give an idea of what they were doing in Afghanistan. So it's kind of the news a few years back. So it was just impossible to understand for the journalist to make sense of this very complex diagram. It was just impossible to make analytically sense of it. And Galloway, at the end of the paper, said, if we cannot make sense of it in an analytical manner, maybe we can try to see the aesthetics to help to make sense of it. So like aesthetics as a way to go beyond the limitation of analytical human understanding. And at the same time, in your book, you are saying so the human way of the analytical human understanding is limited, and at the same time you also kind of reject, as I understood, the radical empiricism of Deleuze and this kind, of affect and matter and all this view that is seen as a counterpart of human reason. So how would you position aesthetics in this question of the limitation of representation and the impossibility to translate from computer language to human language?
Thanks. I don't know that article, Galloway's article that you were mentioning, but I can follow the argument that you summarized there. And what I want to stress in relation to aesthetics is that for me, it's important to consider aesthetics not only in terms of sensation. Aesthetics is so interesting and powerful as a speculative tool, but also critical tool, because for me, it is about the relation between experience and abstraction. And it's precisely located at the nexus of how we abstract and we experience. So in the work that I've done in the past on aesthetics, for me was important to find the logos within the aesthetical, the logical element within the aesthetical, and to put that aesthetics also at the center of logics, by stressing indeed the role the thought, thinking, intelligibility plays vis-a-vis sensation, experience, affect, and so on and so forth. So the operation that I did in the book you mentioned, contingent computation, is to refuse like an aesthetics that would flatten down sensation and thought. And that's in a way, and I'm simplifying for time's sake here, in a sense is the affective aesthetic of Deleuze, the flattens down thinking and sensation onto a continuum. And instead I chose an aesthetic that would consider sensibility and intelligibility alongside as two related but not immanent dimension of aesthetic experience. And in relation to representation, the question is like how to link this to the question of representation now. It's again to the question of abstraction. So the intelligible understood as what can be conceptualized, what indeed can be thought, and hence not what necessarily is only to be felt. And representation links for me is on the side of the intelligible for me, or on the side of intelligibility, precisely because it's not like problematized ideas of experience as immediate, as this immediacy of experience that sometimes affect theory is all about, the immediacy of sensation. While, as I was saying before in the previous question, Andrew's question, you enter experience only by abstracting and hence in a way representing. I'm not still, this is about work that is yet to come, so I'm not comfortable to equate abstraction and representation, but definitely there's a link there, and that's where I'm working with my next project.
Okay. Thank you. So there is a question from Geoffrey. Oh, yes, Geoffrey. Geoffrey, go ahead. Yeah.
Hey, thanks. Your work on this is kind of so interesting and useful. I think you've already kind of talked a bit about in relation to kind of some of the things of the question that I was going to ask, but I guess in terms of the way that you're thinking about abstraction and the differences between different kinds of abstraction, and I guess I just wonder if you could talk more about how that kind of difference kind of emerges, like ontologically or epistemologically, between kind of, I guess the different kinds of abstraction. Like, is this that human cognition involves certain kinds of abstraction and certain ones which perhaps there are some shared forms of abstraction, or is it more kind of rooted in that kind of like ontological difference between like a kind of a gestalt level, or is it kind of more modular or a gradient in that way?
Thank you. That's a great point, because obviously when talking about abstraction, we also need to consider different kinds of abstraction, but within the human sphere of cognition, or possibly the machine cognitive apparatus. So the aspect of abstraction that I'm drawn to more lately, and the one that I'm focusing at the moment specifically, is abstraction as conceptualization. I'm very interested in the relation between abstraction and conceptualization and representation. So I have this kind of triad, triangle at the moment in front of me, in figuratively speaking, obviously, where I'm trying to work out the relation between abstraction, conceptualization, and representation, taking conceptualization as a key element in the way in which many contemporary artificial intelligence systems, some of those powered by machine learning, really conceptualization, it's there. The crux of many problematic points is around the way in which we understand a concept to be. So that's what is next for me, really, to explore the relationship between abstraction, conceptualization, and representation vis-a-vis those systems that operate through what computer science itself calls representational learning. So there's an element of the representational aspect of conceptualization that it's very much there in the computer science literature, and that's what I'm exploring. Thank you.
Thank you. So there was a question from Linda. Linda, do you want to ask the question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Beatrice. I think actually some of your previous answers already answered part of my question. So I used to think that in taking up the question of black boxing, I immediately would think of the question of literacy. And I jump steps and I would think maybe we should start with changing the mathematics curriculum in our schooling so that it belongs to more people, or it is adapted to how the computational culture or the data culture has changed how we relate to quantities and to numbers. But the starting point of your talk is actually, for me, bringing in a very different dimension. That is to think of myself as an everyday user in touch with lots of gadgets behind which there are huge quantities of calculation, AI, deep learning, machine learning, however we put it. So I felt there's a question of experience involved, which you just talk about. And for me, it seems there are, perhaps there are many philosophers who have addressed these issues, but more or less they are moving between objectivity to subjectivity, which could be Kant, for example, by looking at real problems in the world, and then you move to conceptualize, and then you own it as your own knowledge. Or maybe the other way around is starting with impressions and intuitions, and then we start to undo it and try to give it a more objective representation of what's going on. So I'm just still very drawn to this whole question of abstraction as conception, conceptualization, and as representation. There's some hurdle that I have about the term representation, because I'm not entirely sure if in that process it's actually possible to represent anything, but it will be more comprehensible to me to think of procedures, steps, which is what algorithm means, right? So I feel that perhaps should we swing the ball to the other end, which is to think of how to revise the language of computation, how to make it more directly linked to our experience, because the problem of deep learning, as you described, is prolonging that input-output, that passage between input and output. And is it possible that we can overcome this? And would the solution be not just asking us to learn mathematics differently in school, but also to ask people who are working with the languages of computation to undo some of it, or to revamp that language?
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. It's all great points there. There's so much to discuss there. I want to say that personally, I made a deliberate choice of using the word representation here. So I'm using this word fully acknowledging the baggage of this concept in philosophy, in art, in aesthetics, in psychology, in computer science, in cognitive science, in anthropology, in every really field of human intellectual endeavor. The word representation, or its many translations, is a problematic word. I'm using it not despite that problematic origin, but because of that problematic origin. I'm using it partly because that's how computer scientists and computer science and engineering themselves are calling deep learning. It's a form of representational learning. That's a technical description of it. That's very intriguing. And I'm also using it to problematize or engage again with the critique of representation in philosophy specifically, because that's the kind of that's the formal background I come from, and often the kind of debates I tend to refer back or been drawn into again. So I agree with you that we can find different words to talk about this representational element, and it's a question of language. But nonetheless, this is for me the word that we have now, and at the end of this is the beginning for me of new work. The paper that I presented today is a published paper, but it's the beginning of a new monographic project where indeed the question of representation will be center stage. I might end up not using representation as a word altogether when I finish that project, because a better one has come up and it's more useful one. But for the moment, for me, it's the question that needs to be answered. In a way, it's also useful for me because it helps me to engage again with a problem that I tackled in my first book, but I keep going back to it. It is the problem of the image of thought, how we represent to ourselves what thinking is. And it's also interesting how in that philosophical terminology, the language of image, of imagining, it's again used. So you see, despite being the problem of the image of thought being something that was put forth by Deleuze in his non-representational philosophy, but nonetheless using a very representational language to describe of a representation. So it's a bit of a vicious circle there, but one that nonetheless is fun to engage with. And thank you. There's many points in your question. Thanks.
Thank you. So yeah, when you discuss this idea of like representation and in your work, like there is, so you look at the formalization and you know, like what we might call like the analytical dimension. Doesn't mean analytical philosophy, but like analytical dimension of some people thinking about computation and some computational systems as as technologies, and at the same time, you are in your work you use the thought of people like Alfred North Whitehead, who are mathematicians, but who have also a very speculative thought. And when you were saying like you are interested in the question of how do we represent our thought to ourselves, I think like when we read someone like Whitehead, there is all this new vocabulary he comes up with, and that kind of change the way we can represent thought process to ourselves, or a different manner to think about, you know, human psychology or how things are working outside. So can you discuss like this dimension in your work where there is an analytical part? I don't think it's not analytical philosophy, and there's also a more speculative philosophy dimension. How does that feed each other?
Yeah, by training and inclination, I'm firstly a continental philosopher in the sense that that's where I come from in terms of my professional training and also my own professional inclination, in the sense the way in which the questions that I am drawn to are definitely continental questions, continental philosophy questions. This divide is useful and not useful, the divide between continental and analytic. It's useful to locate and map different historical and conceptual contributions, but it's unuseful whenever it stops us from engaging with problems that are either one side or the other side of this barricade. And so you're right to say that in my work, I don't care for this barricade, in the sense that if there's something that interests me within analytic philosophy, despite my training and my preferences for continental philosophy, I will go and look at the problem within analytical philosophy. But yes, I'm bringing in the tools and the conceptual toolkit and most of all the questions of continental philosophy. For what computation is concerned and philosophy of computation is concerned, there is a need to do the kind of continental philosophy work on computation, precisely because so many questions that were keenly central to continental philosophy are now being reshaped or revamped or reconsidered through computational lenses, or because of what computation does in the world. So in a way, simplifying again, I don't find the divide. I use it metaphorically to speak with people analytic continental philosophy, because we know what we are referring to when we use those labels. But as any label is limiting and restricting, but what it needs to be done, in my view, is engaging with analytic problem, take computation from analytic philosophy, bring it back, or bring it in for the first time. I don't know if Never's been in to start with continental philosophy to address those questions that continental philosophy cares for vis-a-vis computation. So yes, there is a porosity between the two sides of philosophical inquiries that I found very fruitful and useful, despite the limitation of the.
Thank you. So, are there any other questions from the audience? Like, if you want to ask directly to Beatrice, or you want to write in the chat? Winnie, Hector, no question? Okay. Okay, so we were supposed to finish at 9:50, so seems like we are good. Yeah, no question, Hector. You're sure? You still have a few minutes? No? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Beatrice.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, and we hope to see you in real life soon, when we can go out and travel. And okay, thank you again, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you for the organization, to the team of Linda and Hector.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.